Chapter 1. Chloroform, CHCl3, 1915. It would of course be in the cursed winter of 1915, when ice storms had glassed over the city, when Typhoid Mary had come sneaking back, when the Manhattan coroner was discovered to be skunk drunk at crime scenes, that the loony little porter would confess to 8 poison murders. At first, the confession seemed just more of the general craziness spiking across the city. New York was mired in winter, horse-drawn carriages careening through snow-drifted Broadway, trolleys stuck in place from the Bronx to Coney Island as the weight of ice dragged down the lines. The streets commissioner had hired 15,000 snow fighters, as he called them, to dig out the roadways. Even as the fighters shoveled and chopped, new snow dropped, new sleet kept falling, laying down yet another treacherous layer. During those same days of darkening skies and frozen streets, public authorities were desperately trying to stop a sudden outbreak of typhoid fever. The city's most notorious carrier, Typhoid Mary Mallon, had violated the conditions of her release from a sanitarium and gone to work as a cook at a local hospital. 25 people were sick and 2 dead before they managed to hunt her down and take her, screaming and cursing them for persecution, back into custody. The city's coroner had been no help in that investigation, if indeed he ever was. Instead, Patrick Reardon was trying to fast-talk himself out of charges that he showed up for work sodden drunk. Or as one angry witness put it, he stumbled into a death scene with a glassy eye and smirky face to sneer at bodies. That indictment followed an accident on the 9th Avenue Elevated, the crowded commuter line run by the private Interborough Rapid Transit Company. The collision had occurred several weeks earlier, in the last days of December. Newspapers described it like a scene from a circle of hell. Brakes failed on a local. Metal and flame exploded as it went slamming into the back of an express waiting at the 8th Avenue and 116th Street station. The impact had pushed the wooden cars upward into a blazing pyramid. Flying sparks then set the platform on fire. Passengers, dazed and bloody, fled to the street, stumbling down the rickety stairs from the 75-foot-high track, crowds gathering in the firelit dark to catch them if they fell. 2 train workers died in the crash. Dozens more workers and passengers went to the hospital seeking treatment for burns, lacerations, and shock. The papers also offered a memorable image of the coroner that night. 8 hours after the accident, as the hands of the clock were just slipping past 2 a.m., Reardon finally ambled into the police station where the bodies lay. An assistant was holding him upright, officers reported, and he was a big enough man that his weight pulled both of them sideways. Reardon looked down at the dead men. When told their names, Joseph Collins, 52, Gottlieb Minnick, 27, he snapped, slurring the words but saying clearly enough, "It's a shame that 2 such names should pull us out on a night like this." All this according to the notes of journalists covering the accident, who helped trigger a formal investigation of Reardon's work. Naturally, it would be then, in January 1915, in the month of the drunken coroner, of snow fighters in the streets and cholera in the sick wards, that a self-proclaimed serial killer would walk into the district attorney's office, offering up his impossible tale of poison and murder. Frederick Moores was a small man, short, thin, nervous. He had narrow blue eyes, slightly shaggy dark hair, and a beard dusted with cigarette ash. He smoked constantly, those aromatic Egyptian cigarettes, and he paced as he told his story. He was a recent immigrant from Vienna, and his English was slow, stumbling enough that the police brought in an interpreter. "Oh, I wish I spoke English better," he exclaimed during the initial police interview, but the officers were able to piece together the story anyway. He'd come over from Austria in early 1914, wanting to work in medicine. He'd found a job as an orderly at the German Oddfellows Home in Yonkers. The home, a refuge for 250 foundlings and 100 elderly pensioners, paid only a little, $18 a month plus room and board, but allowed Moores to practice his medical interests. He was soon made practically a nurse, because the men over me realized that I knew something about nursing,
and was better educated than most orderlies.
Shortly later, he said, the superintendent asked him to take on another job to help with the removal of some of the sickliest and costliest residents. In the interview room, Moore shrugged, lit another cigarette, and continued. The superintendent was a bully, he'd realized, and it was best to do what the man wanted. But this assignment, he explained carefully, didn't particularly bother him.
It was really a kind-hearted thing to do. They were all in great pain, and that could not be relieved. There was no chance for them. Also, they were not pleasant physically or mentally to themselves or to anyone else.
The only challenge was deciding how to carry out the assignment. After reviewing the possibilities, he decided that poison was the obvious answer. In a place where people were old and unwell, it would be easy enough to make it look as if their time had simply come. The home's nursing dispensary held a witch's closet of poisons, watched over by one of the young orphans earning her keep. There were bottles filled with sugar of lead, those silvery crystals used to treat skin rashes, painkillers such as codeine, morphine, and powdered opium, atropine, an extract from the nightshade plant for speeding up a slowing heart, sweet-scented chloroform for anesthesia, white powdery arsenic for curing everything from syphilis to psoriasis, strychnine for energy tonics, and mercury for infections. The only question was which would best suit his purpose. Moores first tried arsenic, but the elderly man selected for the experiment did not die in an orderly fashion. He was messily sick, then developed a kind of creeping paralysis, living on for several miserable days. Moores found himself on constant, exhausting nursing duty. It was horrible, he said, both for the victim and for himself. They buried the man, whatever his name was, he didn't remember, with great relief. He went back to the dispensary. It was maybe the smell that decided him, that sweet chemical sting in the air, that sugary, seductive promise. He smiled at the detectives and told them why he'd been so pleased with his next choice.
When you give an old person chloroform, it's like putting a child to sleep.
There wasn't a cop in the room who thought of chloroform in terms of a lullaby. Their experience was otherwise. They knew it purely as a poison, one used by criminals, especially by thieves, who found it useful in robbing occupied homes. Since the turn of the 20th century, this practice had been increasingly popular. Robbers would knock on an apartment door, force a chloroform-soaked rag over the face of whoever answered, and take what they wanted while their victim remained unconscious. Burglar uses chloroform, attacks a woman in a flat, robs her and cuts off her hair, read one New York Times headline in March 1900. Beautiful hair for wigs was as valuable as some jewelry, the newspaper pointed out. And there were the burglars who put an entire family under anesthetic in 1907 before emptying their house. The train robbers who drugged a Pullman car full of passengers and emptied pockets and purses. The party host who put chloroform into his guests' drinks, then went through their wallets and disappeared with $3,000. And the robbers who chloroformed an attorney on a busy Manhattan street in 1910, yanked off his heavy gold and diamond ring, and disappeared into the crowd. Occasionally chloroform played a role in real tragedy. A Long Island father, in 1911, killed his son and 2 daughters with chloroform and then, leaving a suicide note, walked away into the gray Atlantic. Moores liked chloroform for its efficiency. He used it to kill 7 more residents with no problem at all. It was a wonderful poison, really, he said, perhaps a little cloying in its oversweet smell, but perfectly, reliably lethal. The story went that the doctor who pioneered chloroform as an anesthetic had recognized its potential after it knocked him out cold. James Young Simpson, an Edinburgh physician, had been searching for something better than ether to relieve pain during surgery and childbirth. Ether could be frustratingly slow to act. Also, it smelled awful, irritated the lungs, and was prone to ignite, which posed a definite risk at a time when surgeons often worked by candlelight. Simpson and his 2 lab assistants decided to experiment on themselves until they found something that worked. They had already tried and dismissed compounds including acetone and benzene when on the evening of November 4th, 1847, they poured out tumblers of chloroform and dipped their faces into the vapor rising from the glass. Within 2 minutes all 3 were lying unconscious under the table, in a trice under the mahogany, as Simpson later wrote. They awoke perhaps half an hour later, light-headed and dizzy but cheerfully unharmed. "This will change the world," he thought. For the next 5 decades, chloroform gained steadily in popularity. Every drugstore stocked it. Most doctors, barring a few wary holdouts, prescribed it in abundance. It was mixed into cough syrups and liniments. It was dispensed as a sedative, a sleep aid, a painkiller, a treatment for alcoholic DTs, for hiccuping, seasickness, colic, vomiting, and diarrhea. No one was exactly sure how it worked, just that it appeared to slow the body down and sedate the brain, sliding a patient into a much-desired stupor. The more physicians used chloroform, though, the more they realized that it was a capricious kind of anesthesia. There were reports of patients who inexplicably, unexpectedly died on the operating table before the surgeon even lifted his knife. An invalid would slide away into chloroform-induced unconsciousness and just keep sliding. The breathing would sputter to bare gasps. The heartbeat would decrease in an ever-slowing rhythm. Alarmed doctors began tallying the deaths. On average, it seemed, chloroform anesthesia killed at least 1 in every 3,000 patients. And no one knew how to fix that because no one was sure why it happened. Chloroform was a simple enough compound, an uncomplicated arrangement of carbon, hydrogen, and chlorine. Yet somehow that tidy mixture formed a chemical loose cannon, killing without warning or apparent reason. Doctors weren't really even sure what a safe dose was. One patient died after receiving 1/3 of an ounce. Another man, a known chloroform addict, succumbed only after going through a quart of the drug. Chloroform, not surprisingly, was riskiest for children, the elderly, and alcoholics, but it also unpredictably killed healthy adults. At the turn of the 20th century, the British Medical Association called chloroform the most dangerous anesthetic known, and the American Medical Association urged that hospitals stop using it entirely. But it would be several more decades before chloroform disappeared from the pharmacy shelves. At the time Frederick Moores lifted the bottle off the dispensary shelf, chloroform was still widely used, still known for being miraculous rather than murderous. The police detectives in their dark wool suits became a familiar sight at the Oddfellows' home, thumping down the wooden halls, opening closets, looking under beds, asking questions, checking out Moore's story. The more investigators looked and asked, the more they suspected the crazy little man might be telling the truth. They found, for instance, a German poison manual hidden in the back of his closet. They gathered witnesses who confirmed some of his story, starting with the embalmer who worked at the funeral chapel serving the Oddfellows' home. Moores had told police that he'd put too much chloroform on the rag used to kill one elderly man. The caustic liquid left raw red marks around the man's mouth. The embalmer alarmed him by asking about the marks of injury. From then on, according to Moores's confession, he'd spread Vaseline around the patients' mouths before applying chloroform. The embalmer promptly corroborated Moores's statement. He remembered being startled by that uneven red scoring of the skin. He'd seen chloroform burns on the faces of patients who died during surgery. Moores had told him a cloth used to tie the man's mouth shut after death had rubbed the face raw. That had puzzled the embalmer. The home had never done that before. The marks didn't really seem to match with the cloth burn. But after all, it was just another old man dead, and the next body showed no such signs of damage, so he'd let it go. That led to another witness, an orderly who'd seen Moores rubbing Vaseline over an old man's face 2 hours before the patient was found dead. Moores had explained to him that the Vaseline would make it easier for the undertaker to shave the corpse. The orderly had been surprised. After all, the man was still breathing. Following that awkward encounter, Moores told the police, he'd switched to another method, pushing chloroform-soaked cotton wool into the noses of his chosen victims. When they searched Moores's room, officers found cotton and tweezers in the pocket of one of his coats. The embalmer hadn't liked Moores. He found him competent but cold, indifferent to the suffering and deaths of those in the home. The elderly residents hadn't liked him either.